and one will be brought to you. So we're back on page 60, and we're looking at Exodus and chapter 19 and verses 9 through to the end of the chapter. And it's been said that what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. It's quite a statement, isn't it? What comes into our mind when we think about God is the most important thing about us. So I want to ask you, what comes into your mind when you think about God? What is the most important thing about you? And as we've read Exodus 19, and we think of the people of Israel at Mount Sinai, and God arriving and God coming, what do you think came into the people's mind about God? What do you think came into the people of Israel's mind about God? Now let me remind you of where we've got to in the book of Exodus. So God has wonderfully rescued his people from Egypt. Egypt and Pharaoh have been mistreating Israel, and they refuse to let them go. And yet in humbling and judging them through the 10 plagues and the Red Sea, God has defeated Egypt. And in doing so, God has glorified himself, and he's glorified his name, and he's brought his people safely out. Having then led Israel through the wilderness, God has now brought them to Mount Sinai, something that God promised Moses that he would do all the way back in chapter 3, and something that he describes here in verse 4 as bringing them to himself. So it's not so much that God has brought them to Mount Sinai, but in bringing them to the mountain, God has brought them to himself that he might be their God and that they might be his people. Now, in the ancient world, when a king conquered a nation, the king would usually make a covenant with the nation. And in the covenant, he would set out, he would explain his relationship with the people and their relationship with him. And then he would outline all the rules and all the laws that he wanted them to keep. So it was all very clear at the beginning of their new relationship. And there's something of that going on here and in the chapters that follow. So God is making a covenant with the people of Israel, verse 5. In verses 4 to 6, he has explained the nature of his relationship with them. They are his saved people. He has rescued them. They have seen what he did to the Egyptians to bring them out. He has made them his treasured possession, and they are to him a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And now he's going to come and he's going to tell them how he wants them to live. And so that's what they're waiting for. They are waiting for their king to arrive with all of his heavenly fanfare and give them his law. And God tells Moses to tell the people, verse 11, that it's going to happen on the third day. So such is the awesome nature of this event, and such is the awesome nature of their king, that they need until the third day to get themselves ready for his coming. So God is not just their next door neighbor who's going to pop round. God is not even like a world leader who is a famous celebrity. No, he is the Lord, their king. And they need time to prepare themselves for when he comes. And this morning we're going to work our way through chapter 19. We're going to wait with them until the third day. We're then going to stand with them when God arrives, and then we will underline 3 things at the end. And we are going to give the sermon the title, Prepare to Meet God. Verse 17, prepare to meet God. In verses 10 to 15, God tells Moses what he and the people need to do to get ready for his arrival. So what do they need to do? Well, firstly, they need to use today and to use tomorrow to consecrate themselves. Verse 10, and to consecrate means to set apart, to make holy. We're not told exactly what that specifically involved on this occasion, but no doubt it meant time preparing themselves inwardly for God arriving and God coming. So praying and meditating and confessing sin and worshipping and praising and thanking God. No doubt it also meant ensuring that they don't do anything which would defile themselves. They had to wash their clothes, verse 10. They must be found wearing clean clothes when God arrives. They can't have any stains or dirt on their clothes when God comes. Washed clothes, an outward sign of the inward cleanness that they need to have when they come into the presence of the Holy Lord. What else needs to happen? Well, Moses needs to set up a perimeter around Mount Sinai, verse 12, making the mountain off limits. So God is going to come down, he's going to descend upon the mountain, and that immediately makes the mountain holy and given over to him. In fact, this is so serious that the people are not only told that they're not allowed to go up the mountain, but they're told that they're not even allowed to touch the edges of the mountain. It is not a small thing to enter into the presence of the holy God. And the people, they have to keep their distance. They have to stay away. They are sinful and God is holy. And holiness and sin cannot mix. And God's perfect holiness is too dangerous for them. And this perimeter is a loving provision given by God to keep them safe. And if they do touch or if they do go up the mountain, they are to be put to death. Verse 13, whether they are a person or an animal, they shall not live. How are they to be put to death? Well, either by stoning or by being shot through with an arrow. Why those two methods? Well, that was to keep the executioners safe. The executioners were to put them to death from a distance. They were not to touch the offenders. Nor were they to cross the perimeter themselves to carry out the death sentence. And I wonder whether anyone did try and touch the mountain, or anyone did try and break through the perimeter and go up the mountain. If they did, what horror must have filled the people's minds and hearts as the death sentence was carried out and they saw the dead body on the wrong side of the perimeter. You cannot approach this holy God on your own terms. You are a sinner and God is too holy for you. What else were they to do in preparation? Well, verse 15, they were not allowed to have sexual relations during these 3 days. And the reason for this is similar to the reason given in 1 Corinthians 7 and verse 5, where a married couple might not have sex for a period of time to enable them to use that time and to give themselves in prayerful devotion to the Lord. So during these 3 days, they were to deny themselves God's good gift of sex as an expression of the fact that God is the most important person in their lives. Now, how do you think the people of Israel would have felt as they waited for the 3rd day to come? How do you think the people of Israel would have felt as they prepared themselves for meeting God? That's the phrase that's used in verse 17. They are going to meet God himself. How would they have felt about that? Did it feel a long time to wait, having to wait until the 3rd day? Or was it all that they could think of? Surely it must have been all that they could have thought of. Were they frightened even before God came? And going to bed the night before the 3rd day, what was going through their mind? Were there many of them that just couldn't sleep because of what they knew was going to happen? They were going to meet God himself. The people woke up on the 3rd day, verse 16, and there were thunders and lightnings and a thick cloud on the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast, so that all the people in the camp trembled. And this is what we call a theophany, where The God who cannot be seen. He makes himself known using audible or visible signs or things to show that he is present. So you think, for example, of Revelation 4, where the Apostle John is shown the throne of God, and he sees the throne of God, but he doesn't see God himself. He hears thunder and he sees lightning and fire. And here there is thunder, loud thunder, representing God's unmatchable power. There are these flashes of lightning displaying God's dazzling beauty and glory and brightness. There is this thick cloud covering the mountain. The Bible often talks about God appearing in a thick cloud. Why does God appear in a thick cloud? Well, partly because sinful human beings like you and me, we cannot see God and live. And the thick cloud is a mercy from God to protect us and keep us safe. But it's also partly because God is mystery. And you can't fully grasp God. So as you cannot fully grasp a cloud, and you can't get a handle on a cloud, so you cannot fully grasp God. God is mystery. God has revealed all that we need to know about him in his word, and the more you get to know of him, the more you will understand him, and the more you will see of him. And yet the more you understand of him, the more you realize how little you know of him. God is infinite, and we will never ever come to that place where we think we've got a handle on God and we've grasped him. You will never get there. A very loud trumpet suddenly sounds, verse 16, summoning their attention towards their king. Who blew the trumpet? Not Moses, nor one of the people of Israel. The trumpet just sounds. A divine trumpet being sounded loudly. And at the sound of this trumpet, the people, they're trembling and they're physically shaking. Their hands are shaking and their knees are knocking, because this very loud trumpet blast, verse 17, is the sign for them to approach. And Moses, he leads them to the foot of the mountain for them to meet God. Can you get your mind around what that must have been like for them? To have been brought to the foot of this mountain to meet God, with all the ways in which God is making himself known, while still needing to keep their distance and yet being brought near. As the people approach, the physical phenomena increases, verses 18 and 19, as God descends and comes down on the mountain. So now the whole mountain is wrapped in smoke, like the smoke of a kiln or a furnace. Now, there's only one other place in the Bible where that description is used, the smoke of a kiln or the smoke of a furnace. And you'll find it in Genesis 19, when God came in judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah. And Israel would have been very familiar with what God did at Sodom and Gomorrah. And so they would have clearly understood the implications of what is being represented here, as the judge of the whole earth is coming down and he's giving to them his law. There is fire. You remember the last time that Moses was at Mount Sinai, there was fire then as well. There was a bush that was on fire, and it wasn't consumed by the fire. And yet now there is a whole mountain that is on fire, which is not being consumed. A fire representing God's perfect purity and sinlessness. And the whole mountain shook violently. So it's not just the people that are quaking in their boots. The mountain is quaking in its boots too, as God comes. And the sound of the trumpet, it's getting louder and louder and louder and louder, as this heavenly fanfare announces the coming of the King. with their impression of the greatness and the awesomeness and the majesty of their God getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But then you notice, and maybe it's a surprise to you, that it's Moses who speaks first. It's not God, it's Moses. Moses speaks first, and the Lord responds to him in a voice that sounded like claps of thunder. You remember verse 9, where God told Moses that he wanted the people of Israel to both hear and see the relationship that Moses has with God, so that they will trust Moses and believe in him. 40 years later, in Deuteronomy 4 and verse 11, Moses said this to Israel. He said, "You came near and stood at the foot of the mountain, while the mountain burned with fire to the heart of heaven, wrapped in darkness, cloud and gloom. Then the Lord spoke to you out of the midst of the fire. You heard the sound of words, but saw no form. There was only a voice." So though it sounded like thunder when God spoke, they did actually hear him speak. They heard the words. They heard his voice. God, he descends on the mountain. And then verse 20, he tells Moses to come up the mountain to him. And what does God tell Moses? When Moses gets up to the top of the mountain, verse 21, God tells Moses to go straight back down again. And the impression that you get is that he does this almost the minute that Moses arrives at the top. So God, he tells Moses to come up the mountain to him. And Moses, this 80-year-old man, he climbs up the mountain to God. And the moment Moses gets up to the top of the mountain, God tells him to go straight back down again. And you say, why? Well, it's to warn the people again not to break through the perimeter and come up the mountain to try and see God. Why? Because if they do that, they will die. They are sinners. They cannot look upon this perfect and pure and sinless and holy God and live. And God also tells Moses to warn the priests that they need to consecrate themselves. Verse 22, that the Levitical priesthood had not yet been fully established, but clearly there were people fulfilling the role of the priest. And yet just because they were priests, that didn't mean that they could ignore the general command to have prepared themselves. And just because they were priests, that didn't mean that they could come through break through the perimeter and come up and look upon God. And Moses in verse 23, he pushes back. And he says, but they can't come up the mountain. They won't come up the mountain. That's what Moses is getting at. He's saying they won't come up the mountain because you've already told them that they can't come up the mountain. And yet still, verse 24, God tells Moses to go back down and to warn the people and the priests that they must not break through and try and come up the mountain. Otherwise, he will break out in judgment against them. You see, God knows the people. God knew the people far better than Moses knew the people. And God knows that they are sinners. God knows your heart far better than you know your heart. So let me give you a scenario just to illustrate this. Let's imagine that you're chatting with someone, the conversation is in full flow, and then suddenly the person you're chatting to interrupts the conversation and says, "Don't look now, but behind you." What is your instinctive reaction? If you're anything like me, the first thing you do is look straight behind you because you've been told not to look. Illustrating that at heart, you are a rebel. You are a rebel. If someone tells you not to look, you want to look. If someone tells you not to do something, you instinctively want to do it and often try to do it. You see, God knows our hearts better than we know our hearts. And God knew the people better than Moses knew the people. And he tells Moses, go back down and warn them again. They must not come up the mountain. Why? Because if they do, I will kill them. And God will break out in judgment against them. God is too holy for them. His holiness is dangerous for them. He is perfect. And for a sinner to come unshielded in the presence of a holy God is too dangerous for them. This warning, it's given out of love for the people. You think of Aaron's two sons, Nadab and Abihu, in Leviticus 10, and how they approached God in a way that they shouldn't have done, and how fire broke out from God and consumed them. Our God is a consuming fire. You think of Uzzah in 1 Chronicles 13, driving the cart that carried the holy ark of God, and the oxen stumble and the ark slips, and Uzzah reaches out his hand to catch it. And God's judgment breaks out, and God strikes him down, and God kills him. We don't realize how sinful we are. We don't realize how perfect and holy God is. And here the people need to be warned. It's a warning that is given in love. And so verse 25, Moses goes back down the mountain and tells them. And I want to underline three things as we come to the end. And the first is that God came down. God came down. Isn't that just staggering? Isn't that amazing? In Deuteronomy 4 and verse 7, Moses said to Israel this. He said, what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us? Yes, God is holy. Yes, God is to be feared. Yes, God is to be trembled before. Yes, God is awesome. Yes, God is high and lifted up, yet don't miss God's grace. Yes, Moses had to go up a mountain to speak to God, but that alone wasn't enough. God had to come down, verse 11, and God did come down, verse 18 and 20. He lowered himself, he humbled himself, he descended, he stooped, he drew near, he came close. He came close to sinners like you and me. And he graciously put things in place so that he might be with his people and that his people might live. And he spoke to them. And they heard him. And he revealed himself to them. And this is all of God's initiative. God came down. What grace. As someone once said, that religion is like a blind man looking in a black room for a black cat that's not there and finding it. Well, that is not true of the Christian faith, because God has come down. God has revealed himself. He came down here at Mount Sinai, and he has come down supremely in the person of his Son, the Lord Jesus Christ, who in humility and taking the form of a servant was born in the likeness of men and lived among us, and of whom John writes, he revealed his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. People, they have seen the glory of God in the face of Jesus Christ. God has come down, and that is amazing grace. Secondly, God is holy. God is holy. You cannot but be impressed by what is recorded of God here. God is utterly other. God, he's in a league of his own. There is none like him. And we who are finite sinners. We just cannot cope with his blazing purity and his holiness. And it was totally appropriate that the people were afraid and trembled. That wasn't a wrong response. That was a right response. For even the mountain quaked when God came down. In chapter 20, after God has given the Ten Commandments, Moses will say this. He will say, "Do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin." So on the one hand, they should not fear God, but on the other hand, they should fear God. Their fear of God should not make them want to run away from God, but at the same time, their fear of God should make them not want to sin against God. On the one hand, they should tremble before God, and yet on the other hand, they should be drawn to God. And so let's go back to that statement that we began with. What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you. What comes into your mind when you think about God? You see, for some, they only focus on the fact that God has come down. And they focus on the intimacy and the closeness and the friendship that they have with God, the intimacy of their relationship with God. For others, in contrast, they will only focus on his holiness and his utterly otherness and his awesomeness and how he is high and lifted up. What comes into your mind when you think about God? How did Jesus say we should think about God? He said, when you pray, pray like this: Our Father, who is in heaven. God has come close, but he's also in heaven. Our relationship with him is so intimate, but he is still awesome. God is so tender, and he does draw us to him, but he is still to be feared and trembled before. And have you got the right view of God? Have you got the right view of God? And then thirdly, God has provided a mediator. I don't know whether you've counted how many times Moses goes up and down the mountain. So he goes up the mountain to hear what God will say to him, and then he will go down the mountain and tell the people what God has said, and then he goes back up the mountain to tell God what the people have said, and then he listens to God, and he goes back down the mountain to tell the people what God has said, and God could not have made the point any clearer. The people, they need a go-between. They need a mediator. They need someone to bridge the gap between God and them, and God has provided that mediator, and he's given to them Moses. And yet Moses is not the mediator, ultimately, that they and we need. He cannot take away their sin. He cannot truly bring them to God. He can only bring them to the foot of the mountain. They still have to keep their distance from God. And it makes us think of that wonderful passage in Hebrews 12 and verses 18 to 29, and to Jesus, who is so much more superior to Moses, who is the mediator of a far better covenant that is being made here, the new covenant. And there in Hebrews 12, it compares Mount Sinai with Mount Zion. It compares the difference between being under the old covenant and part of the Old Testament people with being under the new covenant and being a New Testament Christian. And for the New Testament Christian, there are still warnings. So we are still warned about the danger of turning away from God. We are still told that we need to worship God acceptably with reverence and fear and with awe. And we are still warned that our God is a consuming fire. God, he hasn't changed. And yet while at Sinai there was distance from God, for us we have been brought near. While at Sinai there was darkness and there was gloom, for us there is joy and light. While at Sinai there was terror, for us there is peace. And you say, well, what's changed? What's the difference? Because God hasn't changed. God is just as holy. And we haven't changed. We are just as sinful. We are just as sinful as the people of Israel. So what has changed? And as you read through Hebrews 12, you see it's Jesus. And Jesus, the better mediator of the better covenant, has come. And by his blood, he has dealt with our sin and he has satisfied all the requirements of the law. And on the third day, having descended to the lowest place, he has come back up and he has risen and he has brought us to God so that we can have life in him and live with him forever. And so this morning we worship our God, who is both merciful and mighty. And we worship the Lord Jesus Christ, who has made that way to reconcile us to him.